The year was 1862, and New Orleans stood at a crossroads, both a city of splendor and decay, where cultural vibrancy collided with deep societal divisions. The Civil War raged on, shaking the foundations of an already fractured nation. New Orleans, with its sprawling streets lined with French architecture and its riverside views, was a hub of both commerce and chaos. Yet, behind the grand facades and the ornate balconies, a darker world existed, one that was hidden behind the iron gates of the city's asylum. In one of the more forgotten corners of this historical period, there exists the strange and chilling tale of a patient at the New Orleans Asylum, an individual whose label, scrawled in faded ink across their medical record, marked them as something far more disturbing, non-human. To the modern viewer, it is a label that is unsettling, inhumane, and frankly, difficult to comprehend. How could any person, in any circumstance, be reduced to such a dehumanizing classification? Yet, this was not just a simple oversight in a medical ledger, it was a reflection of something much deeper, society's evolving and, at times, barbaric, understanding of what it meant to be human. The label itself, non-human, was not merely a cold description used in a clinical context. It was a death sentence. For this individual, the mere act of existing was enough to draw the attention of the medical and social authorities, who viewed them not as a person but as an anomaly, a curiosity, something that deserved to be locked away and studied. The cruel irony lies in the fact that it wasn't the patient's actions that defined them, but their very existence that sparked a disquieting curiosity. Was this a product of madness, a reflection of the patient's behavior, or was there something more sinister at play, something that spoke to the prejudices, fears, and limitations of 19th century medical science? Imagine being in their shoes, locked away behind cold, stone walls, reduced to a label that stripped away every ounce of humanity. No longer a person with desires, hopes, and fears, but a mere subject of study, an experiment in the eyes of the doctors and specialists who were trying to categorize the unexplainable. There was no sympathy, no compassion, just a clinical, almost detached approach to human suffering. How did this patient find themselves trapped in such a horrific existence? And, more hauntingly, how many others were subjected to the same fate? This is where our journey begins, in the depths of a world where identity was warped, and labels carried a devastating weight. The New Orleans Asylum, where this story unfolds, was a place designed to house those deemed mentally ill, those whose behaviors deviated from the norm. But at the time, what was considered normal was subjective, often influenced by social, racial, and economic factors. Mental illness, at this time, was not understood in the scientific sense that we now recognize today. Psychiatrists, or alienists as they were called back then, were still trying to make sense of the human mind, working with limited knowledge and often misguided theories. What they did understand, however, was that certain behaviors needed to be controlled, sometimes through force, sometimes through isolation, and sometimes through practices that bordered on cruelty. At the heart of this story is the simple yet haunting question: what happens when the medical community fails to recognize the full spectrum of humanity? In a society where the lines between what is considered human and what is considered other were blurred by race, class, and even gender, the asylum became a symbol of control, a place where society's fears and misunderstandings could be contained behind high walls. Within this institution, people were not seen for who they were, but for how they fit into the narrow boxes that society created. If you were a woman exhibiting behavior that was deemed too outspoken or defiant, you could be locked away. If you were a person of color who exhibited signs of rebellion or simply did not conform to the expectations of your station in life, you could be labeled as out of control. And if you happened to exist outside the rigid norms of the time in any way, if you were poor, immigrant, or just different, the asylum was waiting for you. It is this dark world, the world of the asylum, that the patient-marked non-human entered. And it is within this world that we will attempt to uncover the circumstances that led to the terrifying fate of this individual. But first, we must ask, how did this person come to be seen as less than human? What factors led to the stripping away of their dignity and identity? Was this simply a case of medical ignorance, or was there a more deeply ingrained, sinister force at play in the mind of the doctors and administrators who made such a classification possible? This wasn't the only case of its kind. While this patient's fate may have been more extreme, the asylum in New Orleans was filled with individuals who were similarly reduced to labels and diagnoses. The practice of categorizing people as mentally ill based on behavior was rampant, and the diagnostic methods were rudimentary, often bordering on absurd. Behaviors that we now recognize as symptoms of anxiety, depression, or even PTSD were often treated as evidence of dangerous insanity. The line between medical treatment and cruel punishment was often blurred, and many patients suffered horrific consequences because of it. Now, imagine the moment when the label non-human was first applied to this individual. What went through the mind of the doctor who made this decision? Did they understand the implications of their words? Did they even care? Or was this just another case of medical hubris, where a professional, standing in their ivory tower, decided that they knew best and that they could disregard the person in front of them as less than human? The label itself became a symbol of the power dynamics at play within the asylum, a chilling reminder of how easily the human mind can be dehumanized when subjected to ignorance and fear. But perhaps, most haunting of all, is the notion that this label didn't just reflect the individual's medical condition, it reflected the society that created it. New Orleans, like much of the world at that time, was grappling with the aftershocks of slavery, the shifting dynamics of race and class, and a society unsure of how to deal with people who existed outside the prescribed norms. The non-human label may have been a medical term, but it was also a social one. It spoke to the broader prejudices and fears that plagued the 19th century. It was easier to label someone as less than human than to confront the complexities of race, mental illness, and class. It was easier to lock them away and forget them than to deal with the uncomfortable truths that such individuals brought to light. As we peel back the layers of this story, we are forced to confront these difficult questions. How often do we still use labels to justify our treatment of others? How many people today are still marked, in one way or another, as non-human by society standards? And, perhaps most unsettling, what happens when we allow these labels to go unchecked? The tragic story of the patient marked non-human is not just a relic of the past. It is a mirror, reflecting our present-day fears, prejudices, and misunderstandings. It forces us to look at ourselves and ask whether we have truly progressed or if we have simply found new ways to dehumanize the people who fall outside our narrow definitions of what it means to be human. This story is one that must be remembered, not just to shed light on the horrors of a bygone era, but to remind us of the importance of seeing each individual as a person, not a label. To understand that the true nature of humanity is far more complex and beautiful than any simple diagnosis or classification could ever encompass. And as we delve deeper into the story of this patient, we must remember that it is not just about the past. It is about the future, and the choices we make today that will shape how we treat those who are deemed different or other. In the end, the story of the patient marked non-human is not just about the cruelty of 19th century psychiatry. It is a call to reflect on how we treat the vulnerable, the misunderstood, and the marginalized in our own time. It is a warning about the dangers of reducing someone to a label, to a diagnosis, to a mere object of study, instead of recognizing their full humanity. And it is a reminder that the fight for dignity, empathy, and understanding is an ongoing struggle, one that is just as relevant today as it was in 1862 New Orleans. New Orleans, 1862, a city at the crossroads of history, where the tumultuous effects of the Civil War had begun to cast a long shadow over a culture defined by contradictions. This was a place of wealth and decadence, where the old French Quarter thrived with the hum of bustling markets, the clink of glasses in taverns, and the vibrant rhythms of jazz that would later come to define the city. But it was also a city where deep divisions ran through the very fabric of society, racial, economic, and ideological. These divisions were most evident in the institution of slavery, which still clung to its roots even as the nation was being torn apart. New Orleans was, at that moment, not only a place of lavish elegance but also of profound social and cultural upheaval. In the years leading up to the Civil War, the city had become one of the most significant centers for trade, primarily due to its strategic position along the Mississippi River. It was a melting pot of cultures, with French, Spanish, and African influences converging in the streets, markets, and homes. But beneath the surface of this cosmopolitan city, there were brutal realities that defined everyday life for many of its residents. Slavery was still very much alive in New Orleans, and the implications of this institution shaped nearly every aspect of life, from the political climate to the economy and even medical practices. The city was a microcosm of the broader American South, entrenched in a racial hierarchy that deemed African Americans as property, not people, and fostered an undercurrent of fear and prejudice. As the Civil War approached, the ideological divide between North and South grew ever wider. New Orleans, a city deeply entrenched in Southern traditions, became a battleground of conflicting loyalties. The wealthy elite, many of whom owned plantations and relied on the labor of enslaved people, had a vested interest in maintaining the institution of slavery. On the other hand, There was a growing faction of abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates within the city who were pushing for change. The city's political landscape was a reflection of this battle, as the Union Army steadily advanced towards New Orleans, threatening the status quo and bringing with it the promise of freedom for millions of enslaved people. By the time the Union took control of the city in 1862, New Orleans was teetering on the edge of chaos, its economic stability faltering, and its social order unraveling. Amidst this unrest, the medical landscape of New Orleans was undergoing its own transformation. The field of psychiatry was still in its infancy, and mental health care was, to put it mildly, in a primitive state. There was little understanding of the brain, its complexities, or the ways in which mental illness manifested itself. The term psychiatry itself had not yet fully entered the medical lexicon. What was once called insanity was often misunderstood as madness or moral corruption, and those who exhibited behaviors outside of what was considered normal were often labeled as dangerous or even subhuman. This was particularly true in institutions such as asylums, which were meant to house individuals who were considered mentally ill, but where, in reality, many people were often simply imprisoned for failing to conform to societal norms. Mental illness, at this time, was largely a mystery, an enigma that many doctors and physicians attempted to solve using crude methods and archaic theories. The New Orleans Asylum, which stood at the center of this historical and social turbulence, was no different. It was a place designed to house those deemed mentally ill, yet its practices were far from humane. In a city where class and race determined your worth, the asylum became a refuge for society's discarded individuals, those who did not fit into the neat, preordained roles dictated by the dominant social order. The asylum was a place where the poor, the homeless, the mentally ill, and even those who were simply seen as troublesome or different were hidden away from society's view. It was a place where people were stripped of their identities and reduced to nothing more than their conditions. In such an institution, the line between medical treatment and punitive punishment was often blurred, and the treatment, or mistreatment, of patients was guided by a rudimentary understanding of the human mind and body. In this period of social upheaval, where the boundaries between race, class, and mental illness were often fluid, the treatment of patients was severely influenced by biases, prejudices, and a lack of scientific knowledge. One of the central figures in this medical world was the alienist, the term used at the time for what we would now call a psychiatrist. Alienists were tasked with diagnosing and treating mental illnesses, yet their understanding of the human mind was rudimentary at best. Much of their work was based on outdated theories that often leaned more on superstition and social control than on actual medical science. Alienists often used crude methods such as restraints, isolation, and physical punishment to control patients. In many cases, the treatment was not focused on healing but on subjugating the patients to the authority of the institution and the professionals who ran it. It was during this period of medical ignorance and societal unrest that the story of the asylum patient labeled non-human begins to unfold. This individual, whose identity has been lost to history, was likely subjected to the same kinds of brutal and inhumane treatment that characterized the psychiatric practices of the time. But what set this case apart was the label itself, non-human. The very idea of dehumanizing someone in such a stark, clinical way speaks volumes about the medical practices and societal attitudes of the era. At the time, individuals were often classified not based on their unique personalities or individual circumstances, but by the arbitrary standards of the medical and social elites who held power over them. A person's worth was determined not by their humanity, but by how closely they adhered to the rigid definitions of normal dictated by society. But what exactly did it mean to be non-human in the context of 19th century psychiatry? Was it merely a diagnostic label, an attempt to categorize a person whose behavior was difficult to understand? Or was it a reflection of deeper societal fears about race, class, and the unknown? In the world of the asylum, the label of non-human was not just a reflection of a person's mental state, it was a way of marking them as something outside of the realm of accepted humanity. It was a way of categorizing individuals who did not conform to the norms of society, who were seen as aberrations, threats, or even curiosities. The label carried with it a weight of stigma, and it was applied to individuals who, for various reasons, were deemed unworthy of dignity, empathy, or understanding. As we look back on this dark chapter in history, it is important to remember that the classification of non-human was not an isolated incident. It was symptomatic of a larger pattern of dehumanization that existed not only in the field of psychiatry but also throughout society. The asylum patient who was given this label was a victim of the medical and social systems of their time, systems that were steeped in racial, economic, and class-based inequalities. The very idea that someone could be stripped of their humanity in such a clinical manner speaks to the fear and ignorance of an era that failed to recognize the full complexity of the human experience. The legacy of such practices still lingers today in the way we treat those who are marginalized or misunderstood, whether they are struggling with mental illness, poverty, or other forms of social exclusion. At its core, this story is about more than just one individual who is marked as non-human. It is about the ways in which society has historically defined who belongs and who does not, who is worthy of dignity and who is cast aside. It is a stark reminder of the dangers of reducing a person to a label, a diagnosis, or a set of behaviors that are deemed deviant by the powers that be. It challenges us to consider how far we have come in understanding mental illness and human rights, and how much further we still have to go. The story of the asylum patient labeled non-human forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we treat those who are different, who challenge our notions of what is normal. It calls into question the very foundations of medical practice and societal norms, urging us to reflect on the ways in which our history of medical and social injustice continues to shape the way we view mental illness and human worth today. And, perhaps most unsettlingly, it leaves us wondering how many more stories like this are still hidden in the shadows of history. Stories of people who were marked as other, forgotten, or erased, simply because they did not fit into the narrow mold of what society deemed acceptable. In the mid-1800s, asylums in New Orleans, much like those in the rest of the United States and Europe, were founded on a singular, overriding purpose: to manage, control, and sometimes cure individuals whose behaviors deviated from the societal norms of the time. But what we now understand as mental illness was then a broad, ill-defined concept, and the practices used to treat it were often shocking in their ignorance and brutality. The medical landscape of this era, particularly when it came to psychiatry, was still very much in its infancy. The tools and methodologies available to doctors and alienists, early psychiatrists who dealt with mental health, were rudimentary at best, and the understanding of the human mind was profoundly limited. The term mental illness itself had not fully evolved in the way we comprehend it today. Back then, it was seen as something sinister, often linked to moral failure or even supernatural forces. In an age where science was still grappling with the intricacies of the brain, psychiatry leaned heavily on the theories of phrenology, the idea that the shape and size of a person's skull could determine their intelligence, character, and moral capacity. This was an era when crude measures such as restraints, isolation, and physical punishment were seen as appropriate treatments for those who exhibited behavior that was deemed outside of the ordinary. In New Orleans, psychiatry, or the practice of dealing with what was considered insanity, was not only shaped by limited knowledge but also by the social context of the time. The city was a melting pot, but it was also a place steeped in racial and class tensions. The practice of psychiatry in New Orleans, like much of the South, was influenced by the city's history of slavery, segregation, and the rigid social hierarchies that defined who was considered worthy of rights and dignity. Black patients, poor immigrants, and women who stepped out of the prescribed societal roles were more likely to be labeled as insane than others. This was a time when the medical community's understanding of what constituted mental illness was often colored by racial prejudice, fear, and ignorance. At the New Orleans Asylum, as in most asylums of the period, the staff relied heavily on the diagnostic methods and theories of alienists. But these alienists were working within a framework that was deeply flawed. The theories they followed were shaped by limited knowledge about the brain, and many treatments were based on little more than superstition and the desire for control. Alienists of the time often saw their role as one of maintaining order rather than curing patients. The goal was to suppress behaviors that were seen as threatening or disruptive, to impose conformity, and to maintain a semblance of control over individuals who were seen as a challenge to the established order. One of the central methods used by alienists was the practice of restraint. Patients who were considered dangerous or out of control were often confined to padded cells or physically restrained in ways that left them unable to move. These restraints, which could include leather straps, chains, or even straitjackets, were meant to prevent patients from harming themselves or others. However, they were also a reflection of the medical establishment's utter lack of understanding about the complexities of the human mind. The treatment of mental illness, as practiced at the time, was largely about controlling the body and suppressing what was seen as dangerous behavior, rather than attempting to understand or treat the underlying causes of mental health struggles. Electroshock therapy, while not as refined as it would later become, was also used in asylums, including in New Orleans, to treat patients thought to be suffering from various forms of insanity. This form of treatment was brutal, often used in a manner that was more about control than healing. The shocks were administered without any regard for the patient's comfort or safety, and the physical and psychological toll it took on patients was profound. In addition to electroshock therapy, the practice of bloodletting, a method that had been in use for centuries, was still being employed in some institutions to balance the humors of patients. But beyond these horrific practices, the medical community at the time was also grappling with emerging ideas about the brain. Alienists began to speculate about the causes of mental illness, but their theories were, for the most part, based on very little empirical evidence. One popular theory was that the mind was somehow linked to the physical structure of the brain, and that changes or abnormalities in the brain's anatomy could explain madness. This idea gave rise to the practice of phrenology, which posited that the shape of a person's skull could be an indicator of their mental state. While phrenology was later debunked, it was a dominant theory of the time and heavily influenced the way patients were diagnosed. It was also a way of categorizing and labeling people who didn't conform to societal expectations. The New Orleans Asylum, with its corridors echoing with the sounds of suffering and confusion, was a prime example of how medical ignorance met the social prejudices of the day. For patients marked with a label like non-human, the treatment they endured was not just about medical intervention. It was about a society trying to exert control over the unpredictable, the chaotic, and the misunderstood. Mental illness was often seen as something that threatened social stability. Those who exhibited behavior deemed irrational or unruly were often isolated and restrained, as though their very presence posed a risk to the established order. In such an environment, the idea that an individual could be classified as non-human doesn't seem so out of place. The asylum was a place where human beings were reduced to their symptoms, their behaviors, their failures to meet societal expectations. But these expectations were deeply flawed, based on a narrow view of humanity that did not take into account the complexities of mental health, race, or social class. Those who were considered insane were often stripped of their humanity and left to languish in dark, cold cells, their voices silenced by the overwhelming power of the institution. The emergence of the psychiatric profession itself during this period is a key element in understanding the tragic fate of individuals marked with labels like non-human. Psychiatry, at this point, was evolving from a collection of often misguided theories into a more organized, though still primitive, field. The term alienist had begun to be used in place of the word psychiatrist, reflecting the idea that these professionals were meant to deal with the alienation of the mind from the body, from society, or from reality itself. But in practice, alienists were still working with limited knowledge, and the treatments they employed often reflected more of their own biases than any real understanding of the human psyche. The fact that this particular patient was labeled non-human speaks to the intersection of these primitive medical practices and the deep societal prejudices of the time. The label itself was a reflection of the alienist's failure to comprehend the complexity of the mind, but it was also a reflection of the fear and ignorance that surrounded those who were seen as different, as outcasts. In many ways, it was easier to apply a dehumanizing label to an individual than to confront the uncomfortable reality of mental illness, race, or social inequality. It was easier to control and isolate someone than to understand their struggles, their pain, or the factors that led them to be institutionalized in the first place. The treatment of this patient, as with many others during this time, was not an attempt to cure or help them. It was an attempt to suppress, to control, and to rid society of those who were seen as a threat or a burden. The asylum in New Orleans, like many others during this period, was not a place of healing but of containment, where patients were reduced to nothing more than their diagnoses, and their suffering was left largely unacknowledged. And for those patients who were marked as non-human, their identities were erased, and they were trapped in a nightmarish cycle of isolation and dehumanization. The primitive nature of psychiatric treatment during this time, coupled with the deeply entrenched social prejudices, created an environment where the most vulnerable were subjected to unimaginable horrors. For the patient who was labeled non-human, it wasn't just the medical profession that failed them, it was society itself. The very institution that was meant to care for them was built on foundations of fear, ignorance, and control, and it was within these walls that they were stripped of their dignity, their humanity, and their future. The brutality of the treatment they endured was not just a reflection of the medical practices of the time, it was a reflection of a broader societal failure to recognize the humanity of those who were different, those who did not fit into the neatly defined roles dictated by the norms of the era. In the cold, dimly lit halls of the New Orleans Asylum, the patient who was marked non-human stood as a symbol of an era that failed to recognize the complexity of human existence. This label, both chilling and mysterious, speaks to a larger, more uncomfortable reality of how certain individuals were treated, how they were erased from the social order, and how their suffering was ignored in the name of medical science. Yet the true horror of this story lies not just in the label itself, but in the events that led to the patient's arrival at the asylum and the decisions that ultimately reduced their humanity to a mere mark on a medical ledger. The New Orleans Asylum was a product of its time. Established during the early 19th century, it was a place that, in theory, was designed to care for the mentally ill, offering respite for those suffering from various psychological afflictions. But the reality was far darker. Asylums in the United States during the 1800s were often overcrowded, underfunded, and understaffed. They were places where the mentally ill were not so much treated as they were contained, isolated, and subdued. There was no real understanding of the complexities of mental health, and for many patients, the asylum became a place of hopelessness, where they were simply left to languish in a system that had little interest in curing them. For some, this was a fate worse than death. But how did this patient come to be placed within these walls? What was it about their behavior that marked them as different from the others? And more importantly, what made them a subject of such dehumanizing classification? The patient's backstory remains largely a mystery, but like many others in similar institutions, their story likely involved being labeled a problem by society. Perhaps they exhibited behaviors that were seen as rebellious, out of line with the expectations of the time. In a society as rigid and hierarchical as 19th century New Orleans, any deviation from the norm was often met with harsh judgment and punishment. And in the eyes of the medical establishment, such deviations were not just a matter of difference. They were seen as signs of illness, disorder, or worse, moral corruption. The label non-human was not applied lightly. It wasn't a mere medical diagnosis, but a declaration that this person did not belong to the realm of the human, a harsh and isolating judgment that reflected a broader societal tendency to cast out those who were deemed other. This label was likely applied by an alienist, a term used for psychiatrists of the time, whose methods were as primitive as the understanding of the mind itself. Alienists were often quick to categorize patients based on their behaviors, without considering the underlying causes of those behaviors, such as trauma, social context, or even physical health issues that might have affected the person's mental state. The patient in question may have been diagnosed with a mental disorder by the alienist based on outward appearances. Perhaps they displayed signs of agitation, emotional outbursts, or behavior that could not easily be explained by the limited medical knowledge of the time. But these outward signs of distress were often misread, misdiagnosed, and misunderstood. In an era when mental illness was still largely viewed through the lens of moral failure or even spiritual deficiency, it was not uncommon for individuals who had a difficult time conforming to society's rigid expectations to be classified as mad, irrational, or even subhuman. The individual who was marked as non-human likely experienced the same dehumanizing process that many other patients endured during this period. Being labeled as such meant that they were relegated to the margins of society, their voices silenced, their identities stripped away. In the asylum, there was little distinction between individuals. Everyone was reduced to their diagnosis, their behaviors, or their perceived inadequacies. The psychiatric records of the time were often filled with vague terms such as melancholy, delirium, or mania, terms that provided little insight into the actual mental state of the patient. The real tragedy, however, is that this patient's behaviors, whatever they were, could have been the result of circumstances that went beyond mere insanity. In the context of 19th century New Orleans, this patient's condition could have been influenced by a number of factors, including their social standing, their race, and their gender. For many marginalized individuals, especially women and people of color, any deviation from social expectations was often deemed unnatural or dangerous. Women, in particular, were frequently institutionalized for behaviors that were considered unfeminine, such as displaying too much independence or being outspoken. These women were often labeled as hysterics, a term used to describe women who were seen as emotionally unstable or irrational. Similarly, people of color, especially in the South, were often viewed with suspicion and were frequently subjected to institutionalization if they exhibited behavior that was deemed rebellious or threatening to the social order. This was a time when the medical and social establishments were heavily influenced by racial and gender biases, and the patient's label of non-human was likely the result of these prejudices as much as it was a reflection of their behavior. Once the label was applied, the patient was subjected to the brutal and often ineffective treatments that were common in asylums at the time. These treatments were designed to subdue the patient, to force them into submission, rather than to heal or understand the root causes of their condition. The methods used in the New Orleans Asylum were not about care, they were about control. The patient would have been subjected to restraints, placed in isolation, or subjected to the cruel practices that were often used to maintain order within the institution. Such practices might have included physical punishment, deprivation of food or water, or the use of electroshock therapy. For a person who had already been dehumanized by the label non-human, these treatments would have been nothing short of torture. In addition to physical restraint, the patient might have been subjected to the so-called therapies that were common during the period. One of the more infamous practices was the use of bloodletting, a method that was believed to balance the body's humors and restore the patient's health. This was a practice that had been in use for centuries, and while it was being phased out by the 19th century, it was still employed in some asylums as a form of treatment. Bloodletting was a painful and dangerous procedure, often resulting in physical weakness, anemia, or infection. But it was seen as a necessary step in the treatment of mental illness, despite its lack of scientific merit. The patient might also have been subjected to isolation in a dark, cold cell, a common practice used to control those deemed too dangerous or disruptive. Isolation was often seen as a way to calm the patient, but in reality, it was a form of punishment that exacerbated the patient's condition. Being alone in a small, barren cell, cut off from the outside world and from any human contact, was a soul-crushing experience that led to further psychological deterioration. This patient, marked as non-human, would have been left to suffer in this way, deprived of basic human dignity, their mind deteriorating under the weight of both isolation and the cruel treatments that were imposed upon them. The question that lingers as we try to understand this patient's fate is, how many others were subjected to the same dehumanizing treatment? How many people, throughout the history of asylums in New Orleans and beyond, were reduced to labels and forgotten by society? The asylum, with its walls built to separate those considered mentally ill from the rest of the world, was a place where people could be hidden away and left to suffer. It was a place where people were stripped of their humanity and reduced to little more than their condition, their diagnosis, or their behaviors. And in a society that was already deeply divided by race, class, and gender, those who were placed in asylums were often the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, and the most easily forgotten. The true horror of this story lies not only in the patient's suffering but in the very system that allowed it to happen. This system, which combined primitive medical practices with deeply ingrained social prejudices, was one that ignored the complexities of the human experience. It was a system that saw individuals not as people with unique lives, histories, and struggles, but as problems to be contained, suppressed, and labeled. The patient who was marked non-human was one of many who fell victim to this system, a system that dehumanized people in ways that still resonate today. And as we look back on this dark chapter in history, we are left to ponder the question, how many more were there, and how much of their suffering remains hidden from the world, lost to time? The label non-human was not just a medical diagnosis, nor was it merely the product of a misunderstanding or oversight. It was a reflection of the darker sides of both the medical field and the societal systems of 19th century New Orleans, a statement about how far humanity had strayed from empathy and understanding when it came to those who existed outside the narrow bounds of social norms. As we delve deeper into the story of this patient, it becomes evident that the asylums of the time were not places of healing, but places of control, and the label non-human was a tool of power, a way of dehumanizing those who did not fit within the confines of a rigid societal framework. In a time when the understanding of mental health was rudimentary at best, it was not uncommon for individuals who acted outside the prescribed norms to be institutionalized, often with little regard for their well-being or the root causes of their behavior. At this time, the very idea of mental illness was a concept still in its infancy, and treatments were based on little more than guesswork and outdated theories. Psychiatric care, as it was called back then, was not concerned with the nuances of an individual's psychological or emotional distress. Instead, it often revolved around a belief in physical control, seeking to regulate and restrain behavior rather than to understand it. The goal, in many cases, was not to cure, but to contain. To this end, a person's humanity was easily disregarded. The non-human label likely signified more than just a symptom of mental illness. It was a tool used to strip the patient of their rights, their dignity, and ultimately, their identity. It reflected an era in which individuals who did not conform to societal expectations were often seen as threats. To be labeled non-human was to be removed from a circle of humanity, relegated to the status of something less than a person, a subject to be controlled or studied, rather than a living being deserving of compassion and care. And it was this very dehumanization that allowed the patient to be subjected to the horrifying conditions of the asylum, where the cruelty of the treatment was made all the more severe by the complete erasure of the individual's identity. What is most unsettling about the label non-human is the fact that it was a reflection of the broader social and cultural attitudes of the time. In 1862, New Orleans was still entrenched in a society that viewed race, class, and gender through a lens of exclusion and inequality. This was a time when slavery had just begun to be abolished, and the social divisions that defined the lives of African Americans were still deeply entrenched. It was a time when women were expected to submit to their roles as wives and mothers, and any deviation from these expectations was viewed with suspicion. It was a time when the wealthy and the powerful controlled not only the economy but the very definition of what it meant to be human. The label non-human was not only an indication of the patient's perceived mental state, it was a reflection of a broader societal tendency to dehumanize those who did not fit within the established norms. At the heart of the label was an entrenched belief in social hierarchies. Those who were marked as different, whether due to their race, class, or gender, were often seen as less than human. For people of color, especially, this was a time when any form of rebellion, any display of agency, was met with harsh punishment, and those who fought back against the system were often labeled as insane. The same was true for women who dared to step outside their prescribed roles. Those who defied the status quo were punished, and their behavior was often seen as evidence of mental instability. The non-human label, then, was not just a mark of mental illness, but a reflection of a larger social system that deemed certain groups of people unworthy of empathy, compassion, or even the recognition of their full humanity. The tragedy of the patient-marked non-human lies not only in the label itself but in the system that allowed such labels to be applied with impunity. The asylum, as an institution, functioned as a reflection of the broader social dynamics at play during the time. It was a place where society's fears and prejudices were embodied, where the other could be locked away and forgotten. It was a place where individuals could be rendered invisible, erased from the narrative of human history, and subjected to cruel, inhumane treatment without anyone batting an eye. And within these walls, the line between care and punishment was so blurred that the patients themselves often did not know whether they were receiving medical treatment or merely being contained and controlled. It is crucial to recognize that the concept of mental illness during the 19th century was vastly different from how we understand it today. Back then, there were no established diagnostic criteria for mental health conditions. What constituted insanity was subjective, and the label was often used to control people who challenged the societal norms. There were no standards for what was considered a mental disorder, and as a result, almost any behavior that was out of the ordinary was categorized as madness. People who showed signs of anxiety, depression, or emotional instability were often thrown into asylums and subjected to brutal treatments, sometimes for years, without anyone ever bothering to question the underlying causes of their distress. In many cases, individuals who exhibited signs of distress were simply discarded by society, their suffering ignored or misunderstood. The medical professionals responsible for diagnosing and treating the patients at the New Orleans Asylum were not necessarily ill-intentioned, but they were working with a limited understanding of the human mind. The treatments they employed, restraining patients, using electroshock therapy, and resorting to physical punishment, were based on a set of theories that were not just scientifically flawed but were driven by the desire for control. The reality of psychiatric care at the time was one of neglect, isolation, and cruelty, a reality in which the suffering of patients was secondary to the need to maintain order and discipline within the asylum. And this, in many ways, is what made the label non-human so powerful. It wasn't just a medical judgment, it was a social one. It was a tool used to justify the cruelty and inhumanity of the asylum system. For the patient who bore this label, the consequences were profound. Once they were classified as non-human, they were treated as something less than a person. They were no longer viewed as an individual with emotions, thoughts, and a history. Instead, they were reduced to a set of symptoms, behaviors, and labels. The treatment they received was based not on an understanding of their needs or their humanity, but on a desire to suppress and control. The non-human label served as a justification for their mistreatment, a way for those in power to absolve themselves of any responsibility for the suffering of this individual. It was a way for society to remove this person from a narrative, to make them invisible, to justify their suffering as a necessary consequence of their deviation from the norm. This process of dehumanization, of erasing someone's humanity and reducing them to a set of labels, was not unique to this patient. Throughout the history of asylums, countless individuals were subjected to the same treatment. Those who did not fit neatly into the prescribed categories of acceptable behavior were often relegated to the margins of society, where they could be controlled, isolated, and forgotten. And the more deviant their behavior seemed, the more justified the system became in labeling them as non-human, as something less than a person. This practice was not confined to New Orleans. It was a widespread issue across the United States and Europe. The story of the patient marked non-human is not simply one of medical malpractice or societal ignorance. It is a story of how entire systems, medical, social, and cultural, can become complicit in the erasure of human dignity. It is a reminder of how easily individuals can be reduced to labels, stripped of their humanity, and left to suffer in silence. And it is a call to reflect on the ways in which we continue to treat those who exist outside the norm. Are we, as a society, any better at recognizing the humanity of those who are different, who are struggling, or who simply don't fit in? The legacy of the non-human label, and the treatment that followed, serves as a dark reminder of the dangers of labeling and marginalizing those who do not conform to society's rigid expectations. The question remains, how far have we really come in understanding the complexities of mental health, and how much further do we need to go before we recognize the full humanity of every individual? The dehumanizing practices within the New Orleans Asylum in the 19th century were not merely a result of medical ignorance or the absence of scientific knowledge about mental illness. They were, in many ways, a reflection of a much larger societal condition, a condition marked by an unyielding drive to control those who were deemed other, those who existed outside the prescribed boundaries of acceptable behavior. The patient who was given the label non-human was just one of many who fell victim to this system, which prioritized social conformity over compassion, understanding, or the inherent value of each individual life. At the heart of this system lay a deep-seated fear of difference, one that permeated every facet of life in 19th century New Orleans, and indeed, in the broader context of American society. Mental illness, in this era, was largely misunderstood. It was seen not as a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and environmental factors, but as something far more sinister, often as a moral failing, a threat to social stability, or even a reflection of supernatural forces. People who deviated from what was considered normal in their behavior or thinking were often branded as dangerous, immoral, or even cursed. The New Orleans Asylum, like many other institutions of its kind, was a place where these individuals were confined and subjected to a range of barbaric treatments designed not to heal, but to suppress. The idea of mental illness in the 1800s was framed by the prevailing medical models of the time, which were woefully underdeveloped. Alienists, the psychiatrists of the period, were at the forefront of a medical field that had little understanding of the human mind. The concept of madness was often equated with moral or personal failure, leading to the categorization of anyone who did not conform to social expectations as mentally ill. The most disturbing aspect of this view was the assumption that mental illness was something that could be easily identified and controlled. Those who did not fit the mold were diagnosed with vague and often inaccurate terms such as hysteria, melancholia, or mania, and were subjected to treatments that ranged from the physically brutal to the downright inhumane. For the patient labeled non-human, this meant being subjected to a regime that stripped them of their identity, their dignity, and their humanity. The asylum was a place where a person's entire existence was reduced to a diagnosis, where the complexity of their life and experiences was ignored in favor of a simplistic and dehumanizing label. The process of labeling someone as non-human was part of a broader cultural tendency to silence and erase those who did not fit into the norms of society. This was not merely an institutional practice but a reflection of the larger social dynamics at play during this era, where race, gender, and class often determined the worth of an individual. New Orleans in the 1860s was a city deeply divided by issues of race and class. The institution of slavery had only just been abolished, and the racial hierarchy that had underpinned Southern society for centuries was still firmly in place. African Americans, particularly those who had been recently freed, faced constant discrimination, exclusion, and suspicion. In this atmosphere, any deviation from what was considered normal behavior could result in institutionalization, and African Americans were disproportionately subjected to the label of madness. Women, too, were vulnerable to such labels, especially if they were seen as too independent, too outspoken, or too emotionally expressive. It was not uncommon for women who refused to submit to the roles of wife and mother to be labeled as hysterical or mentally unstable. These labels were used to justify their confinement and mistreatment in asylums, where they were forced into submission and stripped of their rights. In a society where mental illness was so often equated with moral failure or social deviance, the label of non-human was the ultimate form of exclusion. It was a way of rendering someone invisible, of erasing their humanity, and of justifying their mistreatment. For those who were subjected to this label, There was no hope for understanding or recovery, only isolation and degradation. The asylum became a place of confinement, not just for the body, but for the soul. The patient labeled non-human was not seen as a person in need of compassion or care, but as an object to be controlled, a threat to the established social order that needed to be neutralized. The medical practices within the asylum were, in many ways, a reflection of the deep-seated social attitudes of the time. Restraints, isolation, and physical punishment were commonly used to control patients, particularly those who were deemed violent or uncooperative. Restraining patients in padded cells or using physical restraints such as straitjackets was standard practice, often employed as a means of preventing patients from harming themselves or others. These measures, however, did little to address the underlying causes of the patient's distress. Instead, they simply reinforced the idea that the mentally ill were dangerous and needed to be controlled. In addition to physical restraints, patients in the New Orleans asylum were often subjected to forms of treatment that would now be considered brutal and outdated. One such treatment was the use of electroshock therapy, which was employed to treat patients thought to be suffering from severe mental illnesses. Though in its infancy during this period, electroshock therapy was an agonizing procedure that caused intense physical and psychological trauma. Patients would often be strapped to a table and subjected to powerful electrical currents designed to induce seizures, believed at the time to cure mental illness. The treatment was not based on any scientific understanding of the brain, but rather on the assumption that controlling the body through physical pain would somehow control the mind. For the patient labeled non-human, this would have been yet another form of dehumanization, a brutal assault on their very being. Another common treatment during this time was bloodletting, a practice that had been used for centuries but was still employed in many asylums in the 1800s. Bloodletting was based on the idea that mental illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, and it was believed that draining blood would restore harmony to the body and mind. This procedure was not only ineffective, but it also left patients physically weakened and vulnerable to infection. It is difficult to imagine the psychological toll that such treatments would have had on a patient who was already struggling with the stigma of being labeled non-human. These treatments, rooted in ignorance and superstition, served to reinforce the idea that the mentally ill were not individuals deserving of care, but problems to be fixed through brute force. While the physical treatments were horrific in their own right, perhaps the most insidious aspect of life in the asylum was the psychological toll it took on patients. For those who were marked as non-human, the very act of being institutionalized was a form of psychological violence. The patient's identity was erased. They were no longer seen as an individual but as a problem to be solved. Their humanity was stripped away, and they were reduced to a set of symptoms, behaviors, and labels. This dehumanization was a form of psychological abuse in itself, one that reinforced the idea that the patient's worth was determined solely by their conformity to societal expectations. The asylum was a place where the boundaries between medical treatment and punishment were blurred. The staff, often undertrained and overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients, relied on methods of control rather than care. The patient who was marked non-human would have experienced this firsthand. Their suffering was not merely a result of their mental state, but a direct consequence of the institution's failure to recognize their humanity. They were subjected to a system that treated them as nothing more than a body to be restrained, an object to be manipulated, and a label to be assigned. This story is not just about one individual suffering. It is a reflection of the broader societal failure to recognize the humanity of those who were different, those who did not fit into the neat, preordained roles dictated by the social order. It speaks to the ways in which mental illness was misunderstood and used as a tool of social control. It challenges us to think about how we treat those who do not conform to societal expectations, how we view mental illness today, and how much further we still have to go in recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. The legacy of the practices in asylums like the one in New Orleans lingers in our modern understanding of mental health. While much has changed, and there has been tremendous progress in the field of psychiatry, the scars of the past still echo in the way we treat those who suffer from mental illness. The label non-human may no longer be used, but the stigma surrounding mental health persists. People who struggle with mental health issues are still often marginalized, misunderstood, and mistreated. The history of asylums serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of dehumanization and the importance of seeing every individual as a person deserving of care, respect, and dignity. In the end, the story of the patient marked non-human is a call to reflect on how far we have come, and how much further we still need to go, in understanding the complexities of mental illness and the inherent value of every human being. It is a warning about the dangers of labeling, marginalizing, and ignoring the suffering of those who exist outside the societal norm. And it challenges us to ask whether we have truly learned the lessons of the past, or whether we continue to allow fear, ignorance, and prejudice to shape the way we treat those who are different. The haunting legacy of the New Orleans Asylum and others like it in the 19th century is not merely a reflection of past medical practices, but also a striking commentary on the deeply entrenched societal attitudes toward mental illness, race, gender, and class. These attitudes serve to justify the inhumane treatments patients received, the loss of their dignity, and their dehumanization in the eyes of both the medical community and society at large. The label of non-human was not just an isolated case. It was a symptom of a much deeper cultural and institutional flaw that sought to isolate, control, and erase those who were perceived as being different, as existing outside the boundaries of what was considered normal. It is essential to understand that the suffering of this patient, and countless others like them, was not merely the product of a flawed psychiatric system, but also the result of a broader social and cultural framework that allowed such cruelty to exist without question. To understand the depths of this dehumanization, we must explore the ways in which asylums like the one in New Orleans were a microcosm of a society that sought to control the most vulnerable individuals. These institutions were not just places of treatment, they were also places of exclusion. At a time when mental illness was largely misunderstood, it was easy for society to dismiss those who were perceived as different or troublesome. For the patients who found themselves locked away in asylums, their perceived deviations from social norms became their identities. They were labeled, classified, and ultimately forgotten. The horrors of the asylum were not just physical but psychological as well. The patient marked non-human was not merely subject to physical restraint and isolation. They were also subjected to a systematic erasure of their identity. The non-human label itself speaks volumes about the ways in which mental illness was treated during this period. In an era when the understanding of the human mind was primitive at best, medical professionals often resorted to simplistic, harmful classifications to categorize patients. The concept of mental illness was not well developed, and alienists, the psychiatrists of the time, were more concerned with maintaining order and control than with offering meaningful treatment. Diagnoses were often based on external behaviors rather than a true understanding of the patient's psychological state. A person exhibiting unusual behavior, whether from trauma, physical illness, or even social pressure, could easily be deemed insane and placed under institutional care. For those who did not conform to societal expectations, the label of non-human was the ultimate tool of exclusion. It stripped them of their humanity and made their suffering easier to justify. The label itself was not a medical diagnosis, but a declaration of power. It was a tool used by the medical and societal authorities to place someone outside the realm of human compassion and care. It meant that this person was no longer seen as an individual, but as something to be controlled, contained, and erased. This was particularly true for marginalized groups, women, people of color, the poor, and the elderly, who were more likely to be institutionalized. In these instances, mental illness was often seen as a convenient explanation for their inability or refusal to conform to the rigid social roles imposed upon them. By labeling these individuals as non-human, society could absolve itself of any moral responsibility for their suffering. The asylum became not a place of healing, but a place of punishment, where patients were left to suffer in silence, their identities erased and their fates sealed by a label that had little basis in reality. But the effects of this treatment went far beyond the walls of the asylum. The legacy of the non-human label is embedded deeply in the history of mental health care, and it is a reminder of how easily those who are perceived as different can be marginalized, dehumanized, and forgotten. The cultural attitudes of the 19th century did not just allow for the suffering of individuals in asylums, they actively enabled it. The fact that such dehumanization was not only tolerated but normalized is indicative of a broader societal mindset that saw certain lives as expendable, unworthy of dignity or respect. This mindset was not unique to New Orleans or the United States. It was a global phenomenon. In Europe, asylums and psychiatric institutions were also rife with mistreatment and neglect. Like their American counterparts, European asylums were often places where individuals were subjected to degrading treatments, stripped of their identities, and left to rot in isolation. The medical theories that informed these institutions were based on the same flawed assumptions about the mind, body, and society. The treatment of patients in these asylums was not about healing or understanding the underlying causes of their suffering. Instead, it was about maintaining control and order in a society that was deeply afraid of the unknown, the chaotic, and the different. One of the most disturbing aspects of this era was the widespread use of physical restraint as a method of treatment. Patients who were seen as dangerous, disruptive, or simply out of control were often physically restrained, sometimes for days or even weeks at a time. This could take the form of padded cells, where patients were locked away in isolation with no opportunity for human contact. Alternatively, patients could be strapped into restraining chairs or bound with chains to prevent them from moving. These methods were justified as necessary for the safety of the patient and the staff, but they were also a reflection of the power dynamics at play within these institutions. The patient who was marked non-human would likely have been subjected to such treatments, their body immobilized as a means of asserting control over their mind. In addition to physical restraint, patients were also subjected to a range of other forms of physical and psychological abuse. Bloodletting, though falling out of favor by the 19th century, was still occasionally used as a treatment for mental illness. The practice, which involved draining blood from a patient's body, was believed to restore balance to the body's humors and alleviate mental suffering. It was a barbaric and ineffective treatment that left patients weakened and vulnerable to infection, but it was employed nonetheless. Similarly, electroshock therapy, though still in its infancy, was used on some patients as a way to reset the mind. The shock was intended to induce a seizure, which was believed to cure mental illness, but in reality, it was a painful and traumatic procedure that only served to further break down the patient's sense of self. Psychologically, the impact of life in an asylum was just as devastating. Patients were subjected to a constant assault on their identity and autonomy. They were no longer seen as individuals with unique histories and experiences, but as a collection of symptoms and behaviors. The process of institutionalization itself was dehumanizing. Patients were often stripped of their names, referred to only by numbers or diagnoses. Their lives were reduced to mere case studies, their suffering ignored or dismissed. The non-human label was a reflection of this erasure of identity. It was a mark that stripped the patient of everything that made them who they were, leaving only a husk of a person, a mere object to be manipulated and controlled. For the patient who was marked non-human, this process would have been particularly harrowing. They were no longer allowed to be a person with a past, with relationships, with hopes, dreams, and fears. Instead, they were reduced to an object of study, a puzzle to be solved, but not a human being deserving of care, respect, or understanding. The psychological toll of this treatment was profound. In many cases, patients who were subjected to the harsh conditions of asylums suffered from severe trauma and long-lasting psychological damage. The very act of institutionalization, combined with the physical and emotional abuse they endured, left many patients in a state of despair, stripped of any sense of self-worth or hope for the future.